This is a bit embarrassing, I guess, trying to insert myself as sort of one, two, a fifth wheel in a conversation. I'm only 25 minutes and 49 seconds into the recording. Evan has just made a comment, and John Vervaeke is kind of, what did he say? Sort of trying to refine some of those issues and topics to make it more critical in his words. And I roughly agree with what John Vervaeke was saying, and then he starts talking about things that, which he might clean up, but I just felt like I needed to start tracking my thoughts within this discourse. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to. So yeah, I mean, I will probably make a long blurb now. I'll make a decent sized set of comments on what has happened, and then I'll watch more, and then I'll add more commentary, I guess. But maybe this is all covered in the original thing. But so let me just try to clean up, I think, some of the issues that Evan brought up, and he made a very short remark, so this is kind of unfair to some degree, but yeah, so I mean, I kind of in the vogue of what John Vervaeke was saying, but let me just put some more flesh on the bone in terms of that, to make it much more sort of substantive and credible, to give, let's say, examples of why some of what Evan says sort of lacks in John Vervaeke's kind of metaphor of the Protestant Reformation, that it lacks God. Um, is that and I mean, Evan did start this off as a topic starter. He didn't, and he made really a short comment, so you can't really pin him down to how he kind of framed this. But essentially, I'm just going to caution, which is kind of what John Vervaeke did in principle, but let me just make it substantive. The idea that the democracy is accountable for the biosphere, or is accountable for cats or animals and things like that. Um, like it's only I think that in some sense we really have to understand that human understanding, human consciousness is one of the sacred objects, as it were, because of to what it can attain to what the understanding can let's say be in resonance with, or something like that, which opens the door to the kind of to the everlasting, eternal, sort of fourth side of the divided line, or something like that. And we have to recognize that animals do not have this, or at least if they did, then they would be sentient, and then they would be in a different class. They would be in a different. We would then have to, I think, recognize their humanity, to use some modern vernacular or whatever. Um, but essentially, that is the dividing line: is that human beings have human understanding, and they're capable of self-determinism and free will, and they have the capacity for conceptual understanding, um, which gives them their ability to have that free will and self-determinism. Which so just to put some technical uh, uh, description on this, is that many human beings don't have free will and self-determinism, but they have the capacity to develop it, so they are sentient. And so we create a moral class where people that are sentient, or things that are sentient, are somewhat, their lives are sacred. Their integrity is to be preserved in law, or something like that, as the law being uh, a lens of moral, morally attuned with something that you might want to call vaguely commoning, or the commons, or something like that. But I'm going to talk about the problem with sociological reductionism, which I think John Vervaeke kind of is getting into the problem of, or he's maybe about to flip that, because he's trying to say, this is the problem, is that when we see ourselves in this kind of glut of technical environmental conditioning, that then we kind of fundamentally have a degraded self-determinism. We don't really have free will anymore if that's how we narrate ourselves living in the world, or something like that. Which is, again, I think, a kind of spiritual, philosophical sort of, I mean, in some sense, that is the malaise that leads to the kind of consumeristic version of politics, or whatever, or morality, which is the kind of the ill of the current time, or something like that, generally speaking. But let me just say as well, and this might sound a bit strange, but I do actually think that veganism and vegetarianism, for moral reasons, has this morally corrupting influence on society in general. Because when we say that there isn't something special about human sentience and human understanding, when we don't understand that basic category in morality, is essentially when we say, well, there's really, human beings, the torture that is done to a human being and torture that is done to an animal. Now, first of all, I don't believe that animals should be treated cruelly, and I don't think necessarily culling them, or having abattoirs that process animals for human consumption. I don't think that that necessarily. I think that should be done in the most humane way possible, inverted commas, humane, to reduce the discomfort of the animal or whatever. But in some sense, I think that it's actually quite a positive thing that we embody, to some degree, the realization that animals do not have the same moral significance as human beings. But the reason why we sanctify their life to some degree is because some people might not be at the spiritual understanding where they know that sentience is what makes human beings vitally important and significant moral agents, or something like that, or moral holders of legal subjectivity. The legal subjects should be protected by the state, and it's human sentient beings that are legal subjects, or the proper legal subject of the state. And animals don't have that legal subjectivity, but we still want to treat them nicely, because young people still have to grow up before they have a full cognitive, intellectual understanding of these matters. And at least they can understand that you do not cause unnecessary pain to living entities, because that is, let's say, a route into empathizing and to understanding the realms inside the interior of the human consciousness, which you cannot get inside of with an animal there. Yes, they have instincts. Yes, they have estimations even, but they don't have conceptual understanding. They're not sentient. They might even do some clever little things. They really might. And maybe actually some primates do have some beginnings of some kind of conceptual understanding. I mean, and perhaps whales. Maybe, who knows what kind of intellectual, sort of soup that they're in with all the whale choruses and such, and all those frequencies, and they certainly have large brains. So anyway, I'm really into exploring, or at least even assuming, that maybe whales have a sentience that we just simply cannot communicate with, and that primates essentially should be regarded as having developmental. I mean, if anything, perhaps they're our evolutionary cousins or something like that. But I mean, yeah, it's interesting the limits to what. I mean, elephants famously will examine remains and will almost make pilgrimages to the remains of elephants that they used to know. Anyway, but in general, I think that there are certain limitations in other forms of life that I do think probably negates their ability to be sentient. I mean, just for example, elephants. I mean, just a conjecture on the side here. I mean, I think that it is relatively unlikely that herbivores that have eyes on the sides of their head are going to really be able to generate conceptual understanding, because there is something about, let's say, developing somewhat as a predator or as a carnivore, in which one can focus. The parallax of the eyes, I think, is a beautiful metaphor that even John Vervaeke has explored these sorts of things that allowed us to coordinate within ourselves a focus, a target, and that we can have a purpose, that we are aimed at hitting a target or something like that. Without these sorts of things, I think it is actually very hard to converge on a conceptual object in the mind when one is not embodying a physical behavior and activity that essentially, I would say, is on the way to mimicking conceptual understanding. I do think at some point, you have to have, let's say, the native, almost primordial capacity to mimic conceptual understanding, and then it still has to emerge from within itself in some sense. The face of God upon the deep, yeah, the face of God moving upon the waters, moving over the waters. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, you can kind of see perhaps my Christian heritage and spiritual understanding sort of seeping through all of this, but I do think that there's a kind of almost implicit antinatalism and what was the other word? But essentially the word that just means anti-humanity or whatever. I mean, antinatalism is a very particular kind of philosophical argument for why human beings should not perpetuate their existence. But oh my word, what's the bloody word? It just means sort of anthropo. Anyway, people know the word that I'm trying to reach for. Feminists are often called this or whatever. That essentially they just hate humanity or something like that. And I think there's a section of that in veganism in some sense. But it's not just that they hate humanity; it's that they hate humanity because they've gotten a kind of an armchair purveyorship of a narrative solution that we just all need to install ourselves into the rubric thereof in order to be camouflaged in a kind of collective way of being. And so it's this kind of idea that you need to become part of this tapestry, part of this program that is the general solution to a general problem or something like that. And it is disembodied from its own particular, let's say, substantive, subjective, immediate experience. And I do think that in some sense that is where I kind of get off at now complaining about what John Vervaeke is talking about, although I don't necessarily know where he's going with it, where he's talking about how we're conditioned by all these technical things. I don't think we're conditioned by all these technical things. I think people allow themselves to be conditioned by them, and they allow themselves to frame themselves in that kind of narrative. And, people complain essentially, and this I would all boil this down and reduce this down into the famous IBM quote, which is that when people have information overload, then they are stuck having to develop pattern recognition, essentially. I can't remember the exact phrase, but that's the gist of the saying or whatever. That when people are faced with information overload, then they start collating, they start generating pattern recognition. And, I think that essentially this is the easiest pattern to recognize and to grab for, which is that, oh, we're being conditioned by our environment. And then you are a beast. You are just as, you are either impressioned by your nurture or your nature or some combination thereof, that you're conditioned by your internal instincts and passions and by your external promptings and, let's say, contextual encasement or whatever. but it's much the same thing, that you inherited this kind of anti-sentience in some sense, that you are literally just willing to give up your sentience as long as you have a language game, as long as you have a narrative within which to install yourself. And this is exactly the antithesis of, let's say, the sacred and the commons, and it's also, I would say, the antithesis of uh, or rather, it is the synthesis that is the modern synthesis to some degree, or the postmodern synthesis, if I can try to blame those people for it, of this new kind of consumerism, which is this kind of that has grown into this metaphysical consumerism, which I think John Vervaeke has been rightly. I mean, now I'm just sort of copying his point, but I don't know where he's going with the second point, because I literally paused it while he was talking. So maybe he's about to kind of more correctly make the points that I just tried to make. But and let me just say as well, which I've said in another recording, which I do think that all of this common stuff is the wrong way to talk about it. But I mean, John Vervaeke, I think, has correctly said the right thing, because he has said, for instance, that well, I mean, vaguely, I would say my original argument in my last recording about this, which is that it's too much of a sociological metaphor, and we need to get away from the sociology, but we also need to recognize that if we are going to use the sociological metaphor, the commons, in some sense, evolved at the same time that the divine right of kings evolved. And let's just remember that the first kings were not these lofty, power hungry things. In fact, it was very uncomfortable to be a king. It was better to be a noble family, because if you were the king, then other people would always want to kill you and steal your crown. So your head was on the chopping block. You had full responsibility, and you had very little extra luxury. It was better to be a nobleman. It was better to be a rich baron, perhaps, or something like that. Especially, at least before canons kind of centralized political power on this level, but essentially you could have barons that had better castles than the king did, and the king just had extra responsibility, and so you could kind of be part of a political intrigue. So usually the people that became kings were the morally stout people, were people that had the broad shoulders, and then they could essentially also be the first person to be taken out when there was war. Essentially, obviously, you would aim to target the king, because the removal of the king means that you could perhaps annex the land or something like that. That essentially, to the degree to which that the kingship was not, let's say, based on raw power and the fiat of raw power, but was based on essentially somewhat the responsible administration of of things to some degree, and let's say consent by the ruled in some sense, but essentially that consent is kind of the issue of this whole topic, is that it's not about consent so much as it about righteousness and justification, um, and somewhat the problem of sociology in general, which is that when people operate in large groups, it's very easy for them. I mean, I kind of get into this topic when I talk about the development of, let's say, modern capitalism from the Dutch East India Company, and I talk about, let's say, the spiritual understanding that kind of went on with the kind of something like the wealth of nations and things like that. Anyway, I should probably just say that a lot of the times I really speak and I don't have a lot of historical knowledge that's properly contextualized. So I say things that, and I've actually looked it up, and this is quite embarrassing, but America had its revolution before the French Revolution, and I always say that America was made in the image of the Napoleonic corruption. I think, in principle, that comment still stands. Obviously, historically, it's embarrassing, but I just thought I'd mention that. Um, and in some sense, the American system is probably slightly better than the French system because of, let's say, it in principle it could work, but it works in a relational way, in which that, because it doesn't, let's say, ground things in the substantive law, but it grounds things in the procedure of the system. You can say that it tends towards justice or something like that. But in some sense, in practice, it breaks down, and in some sense, money breaks it down, raw power breaks it down, secret societies break it down, secret um, power cabals within the deep state essentially mean that even if you do have equal, in some technical way, you have equal opportunity and access to using the American system and procedure, you kind of, how many black books are out there, how many black book projects that essentially are protected by murderous mandates to protect those state secrets and things like that. Anyway, now I'm talking babble about conspiracy theories, but this is why I think we need, let's say, a solid, substantive arm of the law, um, and not something. We're not going. The biggest concept, really, I think that this whole topic hinges around is the rule of man versus the rule of law. And there's almost no place in the world in which the rule of law actually exists, except for my legal tradition, which has itself been betrayed. But you can go look at my recordings where I complain about that to understand the nature of that betrayal, which is more of a kind of, let's say, a modern political corruption as well. But anyways, it's very sad that if essentially the only hope of the rule of law and a system that inculcates the rule of law is essentially overrun by this fascistic politics, which I do think was uh, rightly developed within America, because America does have a rotten legal system, essentially. Um, I don't want to be too harsh because, in terms of historical context, perhaps it's not that evil, but it is deficient and it is substandard and it does need to be fixed at some point. But anyway, a lot of these people aren't talking about the contemporary constitutional crisis in America, and I do think that America does de facto have a constitutional crisis, even if the people who are happy that Joe Biden is now the president, or that will supposedly will become the president, would rather just kind of ignore that kind of issue. Anyway, it is kind of weird talking about other people's political and legal structures. I mean, John Vervaeke himself is Canadian, so to wade into politics or something like that. But I think it does somewhat behoove us to open our eyes to the contemporary context that makes this kind of conversation even more germane. But in some sense, I think, when our journalism has lost its sense of perspective, all standards have been reworked into these weird kind of consumerist narratives of. Anyway, I'm just babbling and repeating myself. But let me continue watching this, and maybe I'll have something more intelligent to say. Let me just make this quick addendum. I just finished that recording and realized that I didn't even finish any of the topics that I was just kind of bringing up at the end there. My point is that essentially the commons only, in some sense, I think the divine right of kings and the commons were a collateral cultural, evolutionary, or from a societal point of view, development. That in some sense, the right that the king had was justified by the conservation and the maintenance that the sovereign had to provide to the commons. And so in some sense, we have this kind of sociological metaphor for just justification, for the notion of justification and righteousness. And we have lots of problems in our current society. I mean, let me just make a general primer here. Because culturally people don't understand the importance and value of justification. They perhaps don't even believe that it's possible. But generally the confusion that people have is, we even have a term, it's called self-righteousness. And to be self-righteous is to be wrong somehow, automatically. And this is not necessarily so. At some point someone has to say, no, my understanding is actually justified, and I actually have a deserved amount of self-righteousness, but I know that I might be wrong, or something like that, I think is something that can be eminently defended. anyway, I'm not, but let me just to make a general note here as to the lapse in morality that currently exists within culture and society is that people don't understand what values are, and so everyone has their own positive values. Shut up about your positive values. Tell me about your negative values. Tell me what you know that you have a problem with, and let's hash that out. I've general. This is a. I feel that this is dangerous. Me always peddling these kinds of these general sort of things, but essentially, I think that if we come together and we can actually forge a general humanity, a common humanity around these five precepts, or it's not really precepts, but these five loose values. This is how we get past these disgusting racialist social justice people who essentially can't even talk with other people unless they already believe that they can get their narrative to win, because they can't tolerate anyone who doesn't already agree with them or doesn't at least share the same skin color of them, so that they're willing to even hear them out. That kind of abject racist bullshit. But the three important values, I would say, for this new age is to work out when people are not being serious, when people are unserious. That is something that I think that we have a right to be, and I mean that loosely in the vernacular, that we have a right to be upset about, to incur some kind of anger. That I'm going to be angry with you if I don't think that you are applying to this conversation or to this discourse or to this dialogue or something like, or to this communication, the correct amount of not the correct amount of seriousness, but that you are being in fact unserious to a degree that you can't actually affect. You're taking this with too little seriousness to be, and you see this very much in these social justice warrior type ideologues, is that how they will joke around with people who are being serious, and that they are joking at them in a way to dig at them and to prove that their narrative is dominating or something like that. It's a very clear form of derogation, and even perhaps intimidation. It often has a lot. It has also an insinuation of a threat behind it, that I'm allowed to not be serious, and if you don't let me not be serious about what you're being serious about, then I'm going to violently react to you, because my narrative tells me that you are perpetrating so much evil, that if you don't let me denigrate you in this way, if you don't let me essentially be the court jester to you, then I would then move forward into some kind of genocidal, sort of plan against you or something like that. Is the kind of and you also see this in racist, let's say, lowbrow cultures all over the world. You see this, in the kind of, perhaps, if I might be so bold as to generalize against some people, but essentially some people that inherited very disgusting. You see, I don't want to make these horrible generalizations against people, but basically it was a French subculture that made its way into the Cajun South, and then you get this quaint kind of disgusting sort of superiority complex that has to project this kind of that you can mock other people while being so unserious about your own intellectual structures about things that you can just be self-satisfied. And look, you can have your self-satisfaction that's unjustified. I'm not saying that people cannot put up boundaries and say, I don't want to be a philosopher king. I don't care about the sovereignty of my spiritual self or something like that. I want to be a pretender of my own high regard. I want to attain to a high status that is unearned and that is not tested. Fine, do that. But then keep your fucking views private then. You can't just have it both ways. Don't tell me how you are serious about your views and tell them to me, and then tell me that you're not willing to have your views critically assessed or challenged or probed or something like that. Then keep them completely private then. Thank you very much. We don't need that kind of one-way, unserious communication. Okay, so unseriousness, I think, is a true problem here. The next one is, let's say, uncarefulness, and perhaps this is perhaps a slight reiteration, but if people are not being careful enough, now this, I mean, I would also be much more sympathetic to people, because in some sense, you don't know that you're being uncareful until somebody says that I think that you're being uncareful, and then perhaps you need to have a conversation about that uncarefulness, not presuming that because one person feels that another person is being uncareful. It's itself an uncareful thing to impose unilaterally restrictions on what carefulness should mean. They should be negotiated carefully. So that's a very important sort of thing. What I like about these values is that they cut themselves. They cut both ways. The alpha and the omega. This is somewhat the archetype, I believe. I could go more and more into all of these, but let me just move through them, because otherwise this recording will last too long. And then the third one, so unseriousness, uncarefulness, and untruthfulness, dishonesty. We do have to be very careful about dishonesty, and there's a lot of tacit dishonesty that is baked into our system, into our technical system, as John Vervaeke, I think, is somewhat describing, is that if you already live in a narrative and you've bought it hook, line, and sinker, and you believe that somehow, well, we live in this capitalistic dystopia or something like that, well, I think that's dishonesty. I don't think you know what the fuck you're talking about. All these narratives that you supposedly live in, all these authoritative factoids that you rattle off of, because you've got some specialization, because maybe you unplugged yourself into the university so that you could become uneducated and over-specialized, and then your inferiority complex or superiority complex, because in psychology those terms have actually switched around multiple times, because we have a lot of false authority in our society, which primarily, I would say, come from the field of sociology. They come from the field of psychology and are somewhat capped by the wholly very dubious and dangerous form of false authority, psychiatry. And in some sense, you get a rotten legal structure and you get a psychiatrist together, and you can perpetrate I mean, that's the Nazi combination right there. When psychiatry and sociology confects a narrative, you're fucked, because that kind of dishonesty can actually support itself to no self-limiting evil or whatever. It's just forever and ever. So untruthfulness is the value, because to claim that someone's being dishonest, that's perhaps a bit, I mean, I've just made a whole narrative about that, but that's also a bit invidious itself. You can't really be so staunch that but you can I think you can very reasonably and justifiably say, no, I think that claim that you've just made is untruthful. Obviously, you don't want to get down into the atomization of semantics to such a degree that, oh, well, actually that word comes from this root, and this is how it was originally used, and this is, so you can't mean it in any other way because that is the root of the word, or some shit like that. That I think is also a kind of untruthfulness in some sense, claiming the authority over the inflection of meaning that other people are expressing in their communication. So, at some point, this, perhaps you could say, untruthfulness also can lead to a calcification, to a problematic, let's say, system of knowledge about what language should mean, or some shit like that, which is very problematic and also toxic and dangerous. But also the opposite of that can also be toxic and dangerous, because if language has no value that can be anchored in any way, because people use words in a tumultuously chaotic and, let's say, in some sense, that with untruthfulness has to be connected with the notion of faith. That, do you have a good faith or do you have a bad faith? Essentially, there's no getting away from that. And let me just also say that faith itself also needs to be understood in the context of hope. There is no faith without a good hope, and discerning is in some sense, I would root that to the understanding of what hope is. And so you have to understand that some people will discern things in a very, let's say, toxic and critical way, and that will lead to untruthfulness in some person's faith. But to other people's faith, it will sound true, because they have a different hope. Their hope is one of warlords, is one of divisiveness, is one of, a game that only some people can win at and other people must be enslaved by. So we have this contest of hopes, perhaps, or we have some hopes that are good and that are, let's say, axiomatically above the fray to some degree. And this is also a kind of political distinction that must be made. And this is the problem of man in a nutshell. This is the problem of the rule of man, is that people will often democratically demand systems that give them room to indulge in their, let's say, toxic hope, or at least their faithless hope, or something like that, or at least their confused hopes and their confused faiths and things like that. And this is the history of man as well, to some degree. And so untruthfulness really has a lot packed into it, and it has, lots of mysteries that never end and never end and never end. And in some sense, it's kind of like the rationale, the third segment of the divided line, and things like that. You can always make new clouds to look for the truth within. And I would just caution that we should not ground this negative force that we're fighting against history as any kind of epistemological truth. Like, this is why I don't like the Jungian concept of the collective unconsciousness. It can be redeemed within some contexts, perhaps, if it's worked with very carefully. But in some sense, I think, anyway, it's somewhat of a product of the idea that when you have a field that you're going to call analytical psychology, anyway, I'm not going to rehearse that whole thing here, but faith and hope and these sorts of things can get very esoteric, very spiritual, and sadly, we do actually need professors of the faith. We do need sound doctrine, and there are complicated things here, because there are some forms of knowledge which, let's say, are forbidden, because to know them is to undermine self-determinism, is to undermine agency and free will. And so it's not as if those things cannot be understood in some way, but to understand them is to literally denigrate oneself. And so people have this division within themselves. In religions, this is in Hinduism, in the Gita, it's described as the many-branched intellect, that the intellect has become divided against itself in some sense. There's a fracture in the greater of the greater. The one has been masked by a kind of internal schism, which then the rationale is essentially confusing, in some confused sense, being sympathetic towards the screened, filtered view of the greater of the greater. But anyway, I'm using sort of my Platonic metaphysics to analyze this. But yeah, it's a tricky subject to talk about, and this is somewhat. I'm somewhat giving an introduction, a very rambly introduction to a kind of a gospel, and in some sense, there's no way around it. We need to essentially be able to say, well, this is my gospel. Do you have a gospel? Because if you don't have a gospel, then maybe you should get out of the kitchen, kind of thing. And this is the problem, and I mean, you could say that this is also Keegan stage 4 or something like that, which is missing from our society. Anyway, I do think that a lot of my research in psychology will be able to shed light on a lot of this stuff. Also, hopefully, it will be able to displace the current false authority of a lot of bad things that happen in the name of medical care, but also this very decrepit alliance between false authority and corrupt legal systems that create a confection which is very, very dangerous. But I do seek to solve their problems, because in some sense it's not their fault to some degree, because no one has given them, let's say, a very clear alternative. But also, in the meantime, there are other ways of fixing these problems. You could have stable alternatives to the market even. Who is stopping people from developing a community that essentially has a kind of functional independence? You don't have to break away from the country that you're in. As long as you live in a Western liberal democracy, that you're probably free enough. And if you understood enough of the legal structure, you could probably, at least if you have some kind of common law system, you could probably find a way to activate the kind of the freeman sort of a movement, legal movement sort of mentality. all of these things are possible. But people don't. They always want to defer the problem onto the collective. They always want to say, oh, well, we just need another revolution or something like that. Wholly irresponsible. Somebody else should fix these problems. I just need to complain about them and generate activism about them. It's again, I would say that this is another symptom of the lack of just as I want to finish my thought, now I've got background noises to distract me. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to finish this thought. Anyway, okay, so let me just stop this recording now. And anyway, I was going to tie it up into some kind of conclusion that essentially, the problem has always been on the level of the individual and the individual psyche. It's not been, we don't have sociological problems, we have individual problems. And we're being mystified and transfixed by, this kind of collective deluge or something like that. And in some sense, you could say, well, it's the unwillingness to be responsible or something like that. The unwillingness to attain towards, let's say, spiritual responsibility and things like that. I mean, I'll tell you how I get around this myself, is that I think I have devoted my life towards solving these problems. And although I cannot independently declare my independence from the system, I have been working as efficaciously as possible towards resolving these matters, these very weighty matters. And so I do think that it would be possible. I would be part of being able to solve these problems in coordination, in collaboration with other people that were just willing to do so. In some sense, I guess I'm not trying to advertise to people to make such a communion or to make such a community just yet, because I haven't finished my work, I guess. So I'm just this kind of strange hermit. But and usually whenever I'm interacting with other people, I get very angsty because, well, at least now things are much clearer for me because I'm much closer to the resolution of these things. And philosophically, I think I can, in discourse, I think I could hash it out to the right synthesis, as it were. Although the right synthesis in principle, in some general sense, obviously specifically on the ground, you cannot just, kind of implement things because you've got in principle, the right solution. You also need to kind of construct a bridge. You also need to progressively, let's say, evolve the system to some degree. But anyway, and that's a bit of an art. That's not even, I think, something that can necessarily be technically orchestrated or planned. But anyway, I'm just babbling now, so let me stop this recording. Man, this is embarrassing, but let me just go back to the point that I was making right at the start of my recording, which I never kind of properly finished off, which is the problem with vegetarianism and stuff like that, is that essentially I think the solution here, synthesizing what I've now said in these recordings, though I didn't make the point, but I wanted to get to this point, that why can't we just serve this sanctified thing, the sentience that we have? Why do we have to care about the cats and cats' lives matter or something like that? Why do we have to care about the animals? Why can't we just care about the human beings? And because we care about the human beings, we don't want to pollute the environment. And also because, maybe, I want to say people want to have pets, but I do actually think that there is a problem with, I think animals mislead a lot of children into a lot of strange thinking. But anyway, that is something that's, I mean, I say that from my perspective, which is perhaps not, I'm not the only person. There are other people that have different types of psychologies. My typology is not well. My psychology theory is not well enough that I can understand how other people would relate to animals and things like that. But essentially, humanizing animals to some degree, I think, or at least from my psychology, seems like, I can have a pet, and I can stroke a cat and things like that, and I really like the kind of the primitive communication between an animal and a human being. I think is fine. Like, I could really imagine training animals to do things that were useful and things like that. But in some sense, I think that the understanding that the animal is part of human society, I think, is completely corrosive and problematic. But sorry, I'm now drifting from the point that I was just about to make. Is that, but essentially, I was going to make the point that essentially, I think animal husbandry to some degree, in minds of children, is perhaps a very toxic and misleading kind of problem. But in some sense, I think that can just be cured by having a stronger culture, a stronger understanding of spiritual doctrine. I think that you wouldn't have to say, oh, having a pet is a bad thing or something like that. But I do think that there are toxic elements to, let's say, humanizing animals too much. But I've already made that point. But sorry, the point is that why can't we be custodians of the biosphere, be custodians of the earth for other human beings, for sentient human beings, or just not, I shouldn't even say humans, because it's really sentience that is the valuable thing. We need to value sentience, the capacity for free will and self-determinism, because children don't have free will and self-determinism necessarily. In fact, or they often do for quite, I think, a while before they kind of plug themselves into an ununderstanding, a disunderstanding, a misunderstanding. Because to me, there's a difference between mistakes and errors. You're allowed to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. You can be mistaken about being uncareful, about being unserious, about being untruthful. You can make mistakes on those things. It's another thing to make errors. Are you prone to errors? If you're prone to errors, it's not the problem of your behavior, because you can make a lot of mistakes when you're dealing with in a novel circumstance. Man, I didn't actually even finish my whole thing about the 5 values. I only went through 3 of them. Damn, I'm leaving all these topics open. Which one should I finish now first? Anyway, so my point about human beings is that why can't we just privilege sentience? Why can't we be a society and a culture and a legal tradition that actually cares about these things? Let's just say. Now, why does it have to be for the animals themselves or something like that? And I do think that there are spiritual experiences that are had. In some sense, I think I believe in reincarnation, essentially. And if someone wants to be incarnated into a farm animal, I don't think that farm animal should be tortured. I really don't. But at some point, it has to know that maybe the reason why its life is even being promoted is because it's a livestock. And at some point, it's going to feed a human life, and then maybe it gets the impression that, oh, there is a spiritual hierarchy here. Maybe I should reincarnate in the next life to something else, or maybe it's an angel or something like that. Maybe it's just one of the eyes of the hidden fold or something like that. Whatever. But people even forget in Hinduism. I mean, these supposedly vegan religions or something like, or vegetarian religions, were not strictly vegetarian. That the priestly class would say a prayer and they would give thanksgiving and they would eat meat. But essentially, I do think that that is a correct orientation, I think. That if we don't do that, we actually lock ourselves into an earlier epoch of a certain kind of self-imposed ignorance, I would say. Also, it's bad for your brain, I would argue as well. I think to not take meat. But anyway, and by the way, there are specific Christian injunctions around not. I'll read it on if someone asks. But if you search the King James Bible and you type in meats with an S plural, and it talks about those who don't understand Thanksgiving and do not. And who avoid meats and how essentially their doctrine is messed up. But anyway, let me just move on though to talk about the last two values that I didn't speak about. And I spoke about unseriousness, uncarefulness, and untruthfulness. And there are two more values that I wish to talk about, but in some sense this is what makes my whole value structure a bit sketchy, is these last two, because these last two are not values. I call them fake values or faux values. They're not good or bad. They are I call them problem zones or something like that. And the one I would call kindness and man, I can't even remember my own speech now. What did I use? Kindness and positivity. I think kindness and positivity are very dangerous values to try to leverage against people. This is problematic because in some sense we only want people around us that validate something in our thinking. But what happens if someone is error prone? You could say, well, people don't want to own up to their own errors. They don't want to wear their heart on their sleeve or something like that, and they don't want to they want to cut away the dead thing. They don't want somebody else to cut away the dead thing that is noticed about them. Now, I do think that's not necessarily an unreasonable thing to expect. But if you're going to join the fray, if you're going to join the discourse, and you are going to try to cut away the dead things in other people or something like that, the sword has to cut both ways. And so, in some sense, I think that we have to be willing to inspect other people's, let's say, estimations or sense of positivity and kindness. And I mean, I would just say that generally the thing that is toxic about these two things, where you say, oh, well, you're a negative person and I'm a positive person, or you're not a kind person and I'm trying to be kind to people. The toxic concept here is really sympathy. And I mean, I have my own problems to some degree, because I think that my whole, and now I'm talking personally about myself, that I'm still meditating on this problem, because I think my own psychology might be slightly corrupted by my project to understand psychology, because I have created methods of emulating other people's thinking that is on such a deep level perhaps as well, that it's I would say that I'm almost telepathic in my ability to empathize, but you have to understand that empathy is not a magic thing. Empathy is virtual. Empathy isn't real. It's something that you have to commit to doing in your mind, and you have to create a metaphorical connection to somebody else. So you have to emulate their thinking within your thinking, and it is only an emulation. You can get very good at emulating other people's thinking and other people's emotions. But in some sense, you don't really know what they're actually reacting to internally, because you don't know the content of other people's thoughts, but you can know the style. You can be so good at emulating other people's thinking that you can trace out and map out their whole cognitive network to some degree, but not in its content, only in its style, and not perhaps in its form as well. And I mean, I've got multiple complex typologies and psychological, let's say, knowledge that I've worked out. And so if I know the form of someone's thinking and I know the style of someone's thinking, I would even say I don't have to know the content of your thinking to be able to basically judge the problem, the present time problem that you are creating in life and to the people around you and to how you are engaging in things. I can literally, I can see your future to some degree in, well, not necessarily your actual future, but I can see where that program finds its end. I can see the fatalism that's woven into that drama, that melodrama that you are projecting from your false ego complex, which is how, that's what I call the false ego complex, at least in my models, is the style and the form of your thinking, which has an internal problem with it or whatever. And so I'm familiar enough with these patterns that I'm very good at empathizing with people. That doesn't necessarily make me their friend, let's just say, because because I see unrighteousness essentially, and I can see very clearly the problems that they make. And this is problematic because this essentially is setting myself up to be a guru, and gurus are very they're glad flies. They're not pleasant people, perhaps, at least not unless someone accepts you as their guru or something like that. So I'm a bit of a fuck up on that level, but also because I haven't finished my project, so I need to get and write my book, so at least I can say, well, look, I actually wrote a book about this, and I'm not willing to have this conversation with you because you're toxic. But if you're interested, it's very cheap. Go buy it on Kindle and focus on those chapters, because that's what I would say the problem that you're dealing with, or something like that. So maybe that's why I need to have this book, so at least I can create some kind of personal boundaries in space, which I guess, my project of understanding psychology has made me a bit of an unwieldy sort of social unit. It also has made me incredibly alienated and isolated and prone to, I understand myself the problem of not having a cultural anchor. Essentially, if you cannot find collateral support in other people to, let's say, reify you as an outline. I mean, this is what is done in Qigong when one of the greatest healing practices in Qigong is when the practitioner essentially just outlines the boundary of your chakra or your energy or whatever, and it somewhat seals you to some degree in a role, in an identity, because it helps you visualize that somebody else respects you to the extent that they see the boundary between the outside and the interior, or something like that. Obviously this is that itself is an emulation. Qigong, I think, I've thought that Qigong had practices, healing practices, that I thought were actually commensurate with Christianity, because a lot of healing is invasive, but Qigong is I think very spiritually conscious about not invading, not there are lots of these things in many different religions, that it's not worth it. Not that it's not worth it, it's actually bad to take other people's spiritual responsibility onto yourself. Because when you steal other people's spiritual duty and spiritual responsibility, you infantilize them. And therefore you put a ceiling on their development, because you've created, let's say, a karmic contract that actually you're going to resolve it for them, or that you're going to supply to them the answer. And then if they rely on that contract, then you've just helped mislead them as well. So this is why I think Jesus, for example, was so quick to rebuke people, because he was so quick to essentially place against people and put on their plate exactly their stumbling block, manifest for them to deal with and confront and overcome themselves. And then he would help them to do so, but then they would have to ask him, ask and you shall receive, and such and such. Knock and the door will be opened onto you. That you actually have to search for the kingdom of God, and there's no substitute for that. It's not you're not going to find an automatic virtue. You're not going to be delivered this high status or something like that. That if you want to be a judge and a ruler in the kingdom of God, that's all there are. They're judges and rulers. And for those that are not ready for this, there's reincarnation. Or these, but I mean, it's not just automatic reincarnation as well. I mean, you can go maybe reincarnate in another world, in another time, in another universe. I mean, this is in another multiverse, in another alternative. Maybe that's where your soul should rest. Who knows? I can't. The spirit will do as it does according to its own will. The spirit that is part of, anyway, I don't want to go into that kind of deep metaphysics because that's kind of a priori philosophy, but let me just complete this babbling point. I mean, I must say, I'm fighting with myself on some level to work out exactly how to mediate distinctions between the world and the spirit to some degree, because I mean, I think that I've worked out the crucifixion, and I think that I've worked out the integration of the superego and the ego and things like that, but I'm still trying to work out that I can homogenize myself within my immediate field, but within systems of politics and law and things like that, should there be a place for people that want to have, should there be a hellish place where the hard structure of power in a system is eminently broken and unjust? Is that for somebody else to become a revolutionary in their own time? Because I mean, I'm not American, so is it my job to sow disquiet in the American people and say, no, you actually have a constitutional crisis and you should fix your stupid legal system, and your system is corrupt? Is that my place to do that, or should I just be fixing my country? In some sense, I think my country has been fucked up by America, because it was your legal scholars that came over here and polluted our jurisprudence with its corruption. So there's that. Certainly, I have a lot to answer for in the South African context. So much so that I feel like I could not remove myself from this seemingly to escape from a growing calamity and crisis. No, maybe I'm just crazy, but I mean, as instrumental as I believe I was in developing the revolution in 1994, or I should rather say assisting the revolution, but this whole thing gets messy. I mean, I've already put my foot in anyway. Did I finish all the points that I wanted to raise? I was talking about the 5 values. Oh, sympathy. That's the biggest problem, is sympathy. Is how to be involved and not to deliver sympathy. Because in some sense, real comfort is only going to be delivered when it is not delivering sympathy. But yeah, I guess I'm just stuck in my own paradox of, let's say, the problems with judgment itself. I mean, the biggest problem really around judgment is when people have ideologies that are focused on the past or on the future or something like that, and they believe that they know something good or evil about the past or about the future, And then between that, they can kind of promulgate a means are justified by the ends, or the ends justify the means. And then you can kind of be fully driven by the knowledge of good and evil, essentially. And then you are just always coping and reacting and being a reactionary to the conditioning of the environment or something like that. And you've got this external locus of control, essentially, and you've got this fundamental codependency on whatever lineage of culture gave you this mythological understanding of seeing time in this very contrived way, which in some sense is why I have problems with the collective unconscious, because I think that the collective unconscious in some sense binds people in that same kind of narrative, although in not such an obvious way, but I think that the idea that you can forget about what you've forgotten about culturally, but it's somewhat, we still embody it to some degree, but we've just literally, all knowledge has been lost of that subject. And so you can go about rediscovering it, but how you go about rediscovering it is that it'll never become conscious. Let's say in a legitimate way, it'll become conscious in an illegitimate way, and therefore you have to kind of use an illegitimate methodology becomes necessary, or something like that. And that, in fact, is where I think immorality basically starts from this concept. Essentially, instead of saying, oh, the collective unconscious, well, that's a morally ambiguous, problematic, forbidden piece of knowledge that already we should say is a very questionable sort of thing. But we, in so many ways, in so many fields, especially sociology and identity politics, this kind of, the epistemic, what do they call it? Epistemic injustice is basically the same concept as this collective unconsciousness. And it's disgusting how they have leveraged this this monstrous conceptual negator of the understanding, this reductionist sociological proto-fascistic, at the very least, tendency to say, well, no, we demand sympathy for this narrative. Let's get in with the program. This is the bandwagon that's going to deliver us out of this mess. And in some sense, I think that this is the hydralisk of the modern era, and this is the Leviathan. This is the prime beast that needs to be overcome in the political sphere. Otherwise, it will swallow the earth. It will be the nidhogg that consumes the roots of the world tree. And I was trying to work, how do you depose nidhogg? Because is the church then, does the church not slay nidhogg, and then the church becomes, let's say, a counter nidhogg, that essentially, well, you can join this group of people, and when I say that, I mean, like, then there'll be a lot of ones, essentially, that, you have these free radical groups of people who are capable of joining each other and capable of homogenizing with each other, capable of knowing each other, that the members in particular of family churches, in some sense, different sects, different beliefs, that are capable of maybe, is the differences in these nidhoggs, these mini nidhoggs, is that actually each stem, each root in the world tree, that is, in fact, that essentially there is no unilateral giant nidhogg that inculcate, that essentially the root, nidhogg is the root of the world tree. Anyway, I'm getting a bit symbolic and archetypal or whatever, but that essentially the vine that is spoken about is the creeping thing, in some sense, that the church itself, the vine of Christ, the body of Christ, is in some way metaphorically spoken of as a vine, and a vine is very strange because it's both the stem and the root. Perhaps. Or it can develop roots wherever it touches the ground, but I guess anyway, these metaphors. I guess I'm at the limit of my. I mean, in some sense, this is a practical problem. But anyway, I mean, I don't take Revelations as any kind of political treatise. It's a purely psychological thing. These are all things that are happening in the interior. I'm just trying to philosophize about literally hard structures of power, issues about theocracy. But anyway, these things were kind of talking of. Vervaeke basically indirectly mentioned these problems, and these are issues that I have been mulling over myself. But I mean, in some sense, it's not necessary. I mean, I could just write my book, and maybe that's my contribution. And then I could start maybe some kind of Freeman collective or something like that, or not start, but or join a Freeman collective and see how that goes. See how easy it is to herd cats. See how easy it is to create a decent society from the grassroots level. Because I don't think it's easy. I think that's the hardest thing in the world, and that's what's stopping us as a society or as a civilization. But I do think that if we get a model of it correctly, then that model could perhaps be a way to induct other people to follow the model. But that is perhaps also dangerous. I mean, I've also thought that, Ian M. Banks, the Culture series, I've always thought was a very interesting sort of inspiration. I knew Ian M. Banks, in fact, before he wrote the Culture series. When I was a boy, we had conversations. He used to long philosophical, sociological conversations. And he hated the culture. I mean, I guess, yeah. So these are things that I need to revisit, because these are perhaps childhood dreams that were not properly informed. In some sense, this might be the mystery that cannot be anticipated. There's no clear way forward. Not that there's no clear way forward. What I mean is that there's no set, stringent plan of action. I mean, I do think that the New Jerusalem is either the dominant function in the superego, or it's the which is essentially the clearing of the ambiguousness that the false prophet was otherwise. Anyway, I'm talking about my psychology stuff. Let me stop babbling. This is very embarrassing. But I just hope that I covered everything. That the two false values of kindness and positivity, because essentially they can create, let's say, tacit, sympathetic, let's say, they balance field circuits, perhaps, karmic field circuits, and they can't see their own overshoot. And I was perhaps going to philosophize more about the meaning of comfort, and also the flesh and the spirit, or the spirit of man and the spirit of God. How comfort, because there is a synthesis between the spirit of man and the spirit of God, and that's, I guess, what I'm still wrestling with at the moment, at least conceptually. But in some sense, I'm talking about these issues on a societal level, and that's actually my problem. I shouldn't be talking about these issues on a societal level. They don't actually have the constituent component of a society is the individual. It's not the society itself. And I know that that's going to sound profane to some people. I do think that essentially, if you don't have a defender of your faith, if you don't have a defender of your beliefs, then they're not worth anything. So maybe we can remember the story, because we'll look at it later, and we'll when we uncover more things maybe. So let's not forget the stories, but in some sense, if you can't defend your beliefs, then shut the fuck up about them. I mean, maybe don't forget them, or maybe if you think that there's some value to them, like, preserve them in some way, but please don't bring them to the table necessarily, or at least bring them to the table when what's happening at the table is poetry or something. But basically what I'm saying is that the individual is the basic constituent component of society, and the understanding of the individual must at some point be justified. Otherwise, there is no such thing as the commons. There is no hope that can be joined in with, or whatever. It's all this nebulous, vague, ambiguous sort of cacophony of a snake shedding its skin and forever camouflaging itself in something that it's just trying to go along to get along with. But yeah, so maybe I really should just be focused, because I mean, I would perhaps have more insight if I could actually work out, let's say, therapeutic modalities for the different metatypes and the different metagram types, and being familiar with particular metagram types and understanding the nature of their false ego complex. You know, like if I was a clinician, which I'm not, but if I was a clinician and I was able to essentially, let's say, perpetrate my experimental psychology theories onto people, that in some sense the proper venue of this is the church. What I'm talking about, essentially, it would be a function in the church, that I would be something like a deacon, or I would be trying to be a deacon, or I would be trying to be a anyway. But that would give more understanding of the sociological mess that we're in, because I do think that politically the poison that happens is all modeled off of personality style. It is all, essentially, all the things that go wrong on societal levels are, let's say, projected pantheons of, you know, like the wars, the intrigue and the drama between the gods, I think, is somewhat the archetypal messages that are inbuilt into the false ego complex, that when they get systematized into culture and things like that, and into structures, then they end up playing out above our heads in a kind of in a stasis, in a locked war, in a frozen contemplative structural milieu. Anyway, I've babbled on for long enough. It's probably been embarrassing. Yeah, this is over an hour and a half, which is as long as this whole thing. Okay, yeah, no, I think I must stop. So much of my recording on this topic is very embarrassing, because it's out of order and mixed up in a lot of places. But now, continuing to listen to 34 minutes into this recording, I've just had the idea, though, that yeah, I think like the Nidhogg thing, and in some sense the whole Nidhogg thing that I'm talking about, I shouldn't really be framing it like that, because it's very irresponsible of me, because I'm thinking of very particular structures within my psychology research that then make that kind of, that root that and anchor that in my understanding. But I was thinking that maybe the solution is that what is Nidhogg in some sense, and in some sense the Norse religion was correct, that Nidhogg will come and devour the root of the world tree. But that's actually, that is a sociological way, it's too blunt a reduction to look at what's going on. And in fact, maybe what Nidhogg is Christ consciousness. Nidhogg is the technology of the understanding, which can, let's say, devour the root of the world tree and be edified within itself, or something like that. That the world tree, when the root of the world tree is culled, then maybe the fruit of the tree of life is within the entity that consumed the root of the world tree, and that the root of the world tree was then inculcated into the spirit of man. So essentially, and I do think the spirit of man and the Holy Ghost have this very deep connection. I mean, anyway, but now I'm just vaguely pointing at symbolism and Christianity sort of things, but essentially that the tree in the midst of the garden was the tree of life, and that same tree was also the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. That this was the same tree that was just engaged with a different intentionality, that it was the same fruit even, but anyway, that essentially the tree in the midst of the garden. And you see, the midst is not the same thing as the center. It's in the middle of everything. The thing that's in the middle of everything is, I think, the Holy Ghost. And the best way that I have to kind of talk about this is the notion of forbidden knowledge and the notion of the self in the future. Because if you can see yourself in the future, that should be forbidden knowledge. Because if you can know what you look like in the future, if you have an image of yourself in the future, then you are automatically a slave to something that should be dead. That image of yourself in the future should be a ghost that you live contented within and joyful within. But if you know it, if you know what that image looks like, then you become a serpent to that image. You have to slither on your belly. You have to feel your hunger against the ground as you taste only dust, as you are camouflaged by your environment to get to the goal, to get to the future. So you are slithering your way, camouflaging your way into arriving at the future, because the life is now no longer in the present. The life is no longer in the midst of the garden that's feeding your life. It's in the future that you are, and the cherubim, the sword that turns every way, that guards the way to the tree of life, I think in the east of Eden, that keeps the way of the tree of life, I think, is the is essentially what will become the New Jerusalem, but you have to arrive there through the top. You have to go through the ego to get to the superego. You can't go below the subconscious. So you cannot try to dig yourself below the subconscious to get to the root of the world tree. That once you have fallen and you are in this environment of, and in some sense I also think that this is I think the fall was necessary, but anyway, this is a spiritual, I do think that what is being described in Genesis, in the first Genesis story, is the spiritual creation of the world. It's not the material creation of the world. These are categories. I mean, this is why you have, the earth is created void and without form. So that means that there is such a thing as an earth that doesn't have dry land, that doesn't even have, that is literally void and without form. What does that even mean? You have light, before the sun. What does this stuff mean? This is not the same thing. The light is the light in the mind, is the light of consciousness, the light of reason, the light of understanding. Anyway, and if you just look at the creation of man in the first Genesis story, I mean, it's like the invention of prepositional logic that is rooted in a self-image. And then obviously the fall, I connect very closely to how the self-image was departed, was deceased. The self-image in the present was deceased, and the self-image in the future became authoritative. And that false authority is akin to the God of the world, but it's also, I would say, linked to the concept of the false prophet, which is something like the agent of the God of the world in the superego, which is in some sense, in an infant, it is the first imaginary friend, because you have to give up a part of your cognition to emulate the exterior environment. There's the only way to interface with the outside. Anyway, I should rather make a proper recording that just deals with the ontology of the mind, because I mean I have probably refined it a little bit, but there are also recordings on my YouTube channel that talk about the ontology of the development of the false ego complex. Actually, that might have been part of my 4-hour recording that I never uploaded because it had so much embarrassing personal therapy in it. But I'm sure I counted it in some form. It's in one of the esoteric psychology things. But anyway, I was just going back to chiding myself over the whole Nidhogg thing. I think that is the synthesis, is that the whole Nordic religion is itself just very, very obtuse, because it was unconscious focused. It was itself, let's say, in the view that karma and my metagram model, in some sense, has a valor in it, has a chivalry about it, and there's this constant war, which is that essentially the honored dead in the halls of Valhalla, until and even that comes to an end when Nidhogg consumes the root of the world tree. And so essentially, I think that in some sense, what they see as Nidhogg is perhaps the perfection of Christ consciousness, and let's say something of the understanding, the enlightened understanding, which is better than a lot of these people that are enlightened in the East, or in the these some of these Indian sects and things like that. That form of enlightenment is actually, these people are highly rational, they're highly reasonable, but they don't understand their own enlightenment, which is why they can't help other people to become enlightened. They can describe what it's like to be enlightened, but they don't have an understanding of their own enlightenment. They have an understanding of the behavior of it. They have an understanding of the experience of it. But they don't have an understanding of it in itself. And this is why they can't help other people to achieve it, because if other people actually, I think, rightly resist achieving it, because they would be isolated if they did that. In some sense, it only works if you are if someone gives you lots of money or something like that, and they give you some kind of social standing. Because if you in the West, they would just take you to a psychiatric facility and they'd pump you full of drugs. If you spend 13 days under a tree not eating in India, they put flowers around your neck and they say that you're enlightened. In the West, they try to help you. And I don't think either of those are correct, but I think that there is actually a middle ground to be found there, that they're both something like they're not wrong, but they're also not right. And that's the kind of nuance which is that allows that essentially Nidhogg can be a fluid, or what is the Christian thing, that they are sheep in many folds. I have sheep in many folds. The little flock, that it's more subtle, that the Nidhogg that can actually consume the world tree, perhaps in some sense it never does so, relative to some people's perspective within the world or something like that. So the whole thing is, anyway, but can only operate on an individual basis anyway, from minds to minds, or a mind to mind, that it's not, and some people do get impressions of the collective consciousness or whatever, of the zeitgeist and things like that, but these are not, these perhaps also potentially misleading and dangerous forms of guttural, instinctual leanings and proclivity and devotional entrenchment into a system in which there is no understanding at the end of that, or something like that, or they have high standards. They're waiting to look at something that's flashy enough, that looks golden enough, that has the right symbolic, authoritative trappings around itself. This is always I mean, when it talks about the destruction of the Babylon the Great in Revelations, and the description of Babylon the Great is that it has the blood of the saints are essentially the mortar that keep the stonework of the Babylon the Great together, as the whore of Babylon is served in cups the blood of the saints as she does her work of fornicating with the rich men and merchants of the city, of the kings and the rich men who are drunk on the wrath of the fornication with the whore. Anyway, I think that is something of the Nordic state of culture, that they just kind of made peace with that. They made peace with that kind of they were, in some sense, the consort of the whore of Babylon. They saw themselves as the rich kings and the merchants, the kings and the rich merchants of Babylon the Great, which is why when they went into foreign lands, they would pray to the foreign gods, because they had no, let's say, integrity, because, the whore of Babylon is their queen, and the whore of Babylon is not a queen, she's a whore. So that's why they can pray to foreign gods when they go into foreign lands, and then they say, oh, well, your gods must not be, your gods must favor us more than they favor you. Anyway, it's interesting, because I think that this, to a large extent, was the history of British culture to a large degree, but also how the divine right of kings was culturally developed in this kind of warring culture. I mean, a lot of the Vikings settled and actually became great Christian kings. That their bloodlines were originally Viking, so it's very interesting that I always consider the Babylon the Great to symbolize the dominant function of the side of the mind, of the vanity, and the vanity I've always symbolically linked to Cain, and I do always think that is the spiritual line of succession that has developed any hope for redemption. Is that essentially in the spiritual, when I say the spiritual line of Cain, I'm really making a vague metaphor, that the people who actually try to rule, to be good rulers, are the judges. It has been the judges of the world that have brought us forward towards a greater understanding of godliness and of the law of God, as it were. But that the Christian novation, that the law of God is written on your heart, is perhaps slightly misleading when it's not contextualized by all the other pertinent doctrine that, Jesus says, if you want to be worthy to be a disciple of me, you must hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and even your own life. That's not to become a disciple, that's to be worthy to be a disciple. That's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition for discipleship. And so you really see that there has to be a level of detachment, the capability of detaching even from your own integrity in order to find a higher integrity, perhaps. And I think that this is what Cain somewhat symbolizes, is that Cain was not right when he killed Abel, but he also wasn't wrong. This is the problem. That there is something to be uncovered there. There is a greater discerning to be developed Anyway, so yeah, I think that is my problem, is that I keep on seeing myself as just to go back to my personal therapy, which I'm using this as a personal therapy tool, I guess, that I see myself as operating too much for the good of mankind, and perhaps too much for the good of all organizations and societies, and trying to be everything to everyone, which is obviously very isolating and very what's the word? It's it has this connotation of diminution, that my project has been so important, so much more important, so much more vital, so much more probing. And although I think that I have claims to that, also I might be just a complete crackpot and crazy person, that I have just invented all these beliefs in my head that conform to such a narrative. And really, I think I would like to believe that a lot of the things in my past are completely delusional. That would give me, well, actually, it still wouldn't give me that much ordinary normalcy to some degree, because I would still think that my psychology theory was still well advanced beyond anything happening at the moment in psychology or something like that. I mean, but anyway, but that's somewhat of a technical point. So I mean, maybe I need to become more of a legal scholar and a psychology person, in the hopes of reforming my wicked society and my corrupt culture. And there's so many problems that I almost feel like it's not even valuable to try and get a psychology degree. I would have to go through so much junk. I should probably just write my book. Yeah, I guess this is the problem, is that I've always just felt like there's not enough time. I'm sort of trying to put out fires that I see in many places that are related to my work, but I should really just try to finish my work. Yeah, it's being caught in this weird sort of catch-22 problem in the present. And I've always resented the fact of not having the direct power and only having an indirect power of influence. My grandfather always cautioned me about that. And I guess he also tried to correct me about that in his own way. I guess I still disagree with him. Although I can't fault him for some of the history that he basically engineered and created. Anyway, I guess I've always seen myself as a very strange guess this is personal, family, strange lineage stuff. I guess, yeah, these are very strange religious beliefs that the secret covenant was still hidden in the line of the judges. And my grandfather saw some of the scope. But I always thought that I saw more. Anyway.